Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for those who've been here for a little bit and just coming in. I'm Daniel Singleton. I head up Faith Action. We're really pleased to be kicking off this second session on our Building Back Better conference. If you are into things of social media, you'll see the hashtag behind me and the Faith Action tag for you to get involved with and that kind of thing. If you've got comments and thoughts, do please send them through. We're going to have a session immediately after this, but using a different link so that people can have an opportunity to speak and raise their voices. And all through this last period of lockdown, we've been working with government and particularly with the Communities Department to get different opinions, different thoughts, and to feed through what people are saying. So it's really important for us to be able to hear what you have to say, reflect on what the speakers share and what panelists say after them. This is our opportunity to look at faith during the crisis. We had a previous session this morning where the Free Churches Group published their report on the church and social cohesion. We reflected on that from a multi-faith perspective as well and looked at those kind of things. And I know many of you have come to hear from Lord Greenhalgh, the faith minister. I'm afraid that we have suffered that which we often suffer when working with parliamentarians, that he has had to be whisked off to other business. However, we have a very able replacement in the form of Colin Bloom. Colin, I will speak to in a minute, give a little bit of an interview about his role. And many of you have already been asking us about the review of faith that government is doing, and Colin is heading that up. So we're really looking forward to hear from him. This morning we heard about how faith groups, places of worship have been responding to the crisis. But we also had that helpful reminder that actually faith is not just for crisis, but actually a key part of society running all the way through from crisis and in times of peace and harmony as well. And so we want to make sure we keep hearing that message and hear different things from different people. But we've got a jam-packed time together. Then following on with that reception afterwards. So I want to turn now and welcome Colin and say hi to him. Thank you, Colin, for joining us today. Colin, some of you will have come across Colin. Colin and I actually met, I think, when I first started at Faith Action way back in 2007. So it's been a long time that we've known each other and connected. So, and Colin, you've done various different things, but tell us a little bit about your current role and where things are for you at the moment.
So you just cut out there. Did you say, should I tell you a little bit about my review? Is that what you said?
I said, tell us about your role. We'll come on to the review in a moment.
Right. Well, the role last year I was appointed as the government's independent faith engagement advisor, really to look at this whole area of how does government and across its departments, but also some of the government agencies, how do they engage with faith and faith communities, places of worship, people of faith, and then of course I was getting into that, and then tragically the pandemic came along, and I kind of deliberately pivoted away from the review for a period just to help bring together the roundtables and the task force, and to help with the engagement and comms. And of course, that's where I think certainly some on the platform here, this virtual platform, will have come across me. But now since September, I'm back on the review, which will be published next year. And so because I'm independent, I don't speak for the government. Obviously, I'm privileged to be able to knock around with some of them from time to time, and to provide any sort of help and input that I can. But I do see myself very much as a champion of the faith space, so that government can engage with them better. That's the hope and the plan.
Thank you. No, that's really interesting. It certainly has been a very different 12 months for you. Can you tell us somewhat of the main challenges you feel that government has faced in relation to faith over the past year? Okay, Colin has frozen for me. We'll see if he comes back in a moment. Just for the rest of you joining us, do have a look over my shoulder. You'll see the hashtag available there for people to tweet and in this frozen moment. And if you've got questions and thoughts to come to us, we've got this next session after this session, which will be our event reception as such. Now, I'm just spotting the rest of my panelists and they are still moving, so I think I'm still with you. Oh, and I think Colin is now back with us.
I'm so sorry. I don't quite know what happened there.
No, I didn't press eject, Colin, so you haven't said anything too controversial as yet, so you're all right. I just was asking you, what would you say? I mean, you've got this interesting in and out view of government. What would you say has been the main challenges for government over this past period of time, and maybe what you'd say what the challenge has been for the faith minister, because Lord Greenhouse is fairly new to the role himself.
Well, I'll start with that. I think he's for those of you that have met him, I mean, he's a wonderful minister and a really great guy. He's got terrific attention to detail and has really come up to speed very, very quickly, I think, in terms of being faith literate and dealing with some of the complex issues. People that have worked with him, I think, would say he's got a terrific sense of humor and great, he's a great personality. But I think he would say the biggest challenge that we've all had to face is, making those big, difficult decisions, the ones that mean that places of worship were closed or worship was restrictions on places of worship, and particularly at some very sensitive times on the different religious calendars. And I think, I know he would say this, but I believe it as well, is that, we've been absolutely bowled over by the really sensitive, careful, generous and gracious way that different faith communities have, and all of them have been affected, but by the way that they've responded to it. I mean, it's a remarkable testimony to the graciousness of faith in general, that it's been the way that it has. It could have been very different, but generally the senior faith leaders that we've been dealing with have all been absolutely superb, and pushed back when it's appropriate to push back, and try to understand some of the difficulties that have existed. But by and large, it's been difficult for everybody, and as I think that faith groups have really responded well.
That kind of leads me into my next question, and in the moment I want to come to the review, but I just, in our next session, our last session of the day, we're going to be talking a little bit about faith in the future. I just want to dare to ask you how you could see the relationship between government, relationship between faith and society generally. How do you think it could develop on from here?
Well, I can tell you how I hope it will be. My review, I know we're going to come on to my review, but it will coming up next year. There'll be some recommendations. I hope they're obviously taken up. But I think we do need to have another look at how government engages with faith, and what COVID has done. I mean, through the tragedy of COVID, it has rather forced government and places of worship and people of faith and faith in general to sort of have a very close working relationship, where perhaps hitherto they hadn't done. And I think that the idea is, despite the difficulties and the tragedies of COVID, is to really build on those foundations that were built over the past 6 to 9 months, and make sure that we don't lose any of that momentum. So and it's not just dealing with individual faiths, but one of the things that I think government has had to learn quickly is dealing with some of the intra-faith issues, some of the complexities that happen within each individual faith group, the different denominations, and some of the different attitudes. And that's been, I think, it's been a very steep but very worthwhile learning curve. And I think if we can build on that, then I think we will have a stronger, healthier, more productive, not just for faith, but society in general.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, and thank you for answering that. That question was one I hadn't even talked to you about in beforehand. So thank you for answering that on the spot. Let's talk a little bit about this review. You'll be pleased to hear in the previous session, people were saying, how does all these different things, how they link together with this review? We obviously heard the Free Churches group, and we're going to hear after yourself, we're going to hear about the all-party parliamentary group on faith and society, their report they've done about local councils working with faith groups during the crisis. But your review is something different and something, to some extent, something longer term. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the review really comes in four key blocks. The first block is asking the question, is faith, are people of faith, are places of worship a force for good in society? Now, for many people watching this, of course, they would say the answer is absolutely yes, but not everybody thinks that. But it is important that we look at the evidence of the good that is done through places of worship and through faith-based charities, and that work I don't think has been done. And in COVID, of course, what we've seen, as the APPG report has mentioned that you're going to be talking about next, I think has demonstrated how central faith communities are to dealing with emergencies amongst other things, and just the general day-to-day. So really asking the question, is faith, are places of worship and people of faith for good? The second section of the report is really questioning whether government, how government engages. Do they engage successfully with faith in general, and asking some questions, whether it's in chaplaincy, whether it's in education, whether it's in other areas of public life. Is the relationship between the state and faith as good as it could be? The third section really identifies some, I stress some, but not all, of the harms that are done within religious communities, particularly where it's kind of known about. There might be like the 600-pound gorilla that's in the room, but we just need to take the opportunity to, I think, acknowledge that and to address it. I don't want that section to be the main part of what we're talking about, because I think the first section, I think, is going to be the important one. But we have to, if it's going to be a fair and balanced report, we do have to address those issues of harm. And then the fourth area are just the recommendations. So roughly, I think there's going to be about 20 recommendations that I'll be putting to the government to hopefully they will accept. And then I don't know what I'll do afterwards. I'll probably have a month off, and we'll hope that the government will accept those recommendations, and we will have a better relationship between faith and government, but also for government to have a better understanding of why faith is important and the work that it does.
Oh, that's really interesting. Just one area, I appreciate you flagging up the balanced nature of, not just looking for the positive, but giving opportunity for people to say what is negative as well. Why have you decided for this report to be a faith report rather than a faith and belief report as such?
I make in my call for evidence, which please everybody go to fill in and encourage others to fill in. You've got till the 10th of December. The call for evidence, I have suggested some new definitions, or not necessarily new, but I've suggested definitions for the terms religion, belief, and faith, because I think, we all think we know what those three mean, and actually they might mean some very different things, and we need consistency in public life or government in terms of how those terms are used. And I think there is a big difference between faith and belief in the context of religion. You have to have a belief to have a faith. You don't have to have a faith to have a belief. And I think that we use this language. So when government come and they introduce legislation or guidance notes supporting legislation, or they just need to be, I think, clearer and more definite about the language that they use. And so I'm very clear that this is a review which is focused very much on faith and if you like, the religious part of life. And whilst people with a belief, whether that is environmentalism or veganism, they're all perfectly valid beliefs. And I'm not in any way trying to shut down people's right to express their opinions. I'm particularly interested in faith and the religious aspects of society, and so I just don't want those two to get confused.
That's really helpful, and you've mentioned the call for evidence, and it's in the chat function. The link is there, which people should be able to see. We will obviously pass that out more, and if I can really encourage people to take this opportunity. It doesn't come up much that the government just gives that open opportunity to take evidence and to really engage on this matter. It's worth just reflecting on those different parts that Colin's talked about as you come to do your answer. It's not the quickest thing in the world, but it ain't terribly long either. It's not an exam. You can't get your answers wrong. So do have a crack at it. I have done that myself, so I wouldn't recommend it, having not done it myself, or would tell you at least in that sense. So so do take opportunity. We need to knock along, and I know that Colin has got to jump in some other meetings as well. So I want to thank you, Colin, for joining us. And I'm sure if there's particular questions that people have passed us in the chat, we'll feed those through to you, and so people can hear from you on those. Let me just take this moment to introduce Marcus Jones, who's going to be taking us through the next session. Marcus Jones is the Director of News and Digital at the Premier Christian Radio, Premier News. So welcome, Marcus. How are you doing?
I'm doing really good. Thank you, Daniel, and thanks for inviting me to be part of your event. Really do appreciate the opportunity. Faith Action does some great work around the country supporting faith groups. I've seen that firsthand. So delighted to be with you for this next part of your event. So joining me in conversation for the next 20 minutes or so as we continue this theme of faith during the crisis is Chris Baker. Chris is William Temple Professor of Religion and Public Life in the Faiths and Civil Society Unit at Goldsmiths University of London. He was one of the primary researchers working on the Keeping the Faith report, which we will look at in a few moments' time. Also joining us is Dr. David Solis. David is the Partnerships Coordinator at Faith Action and has been heavily involved in running its Faith COVID Response Project since June. He was also principally involved in coordinating a series of 9 regional roundtables on faith and community cohesion. Thank you to you both for your time today. Chris, let's start with you then, and the Keeping the Faith report, which you've been working on for a little while now. It looks at the relationship between local authorities and faith groups in light of the pandemic. Just talk us through some of the key findings of this report.
Thanks, Marcus. So the report was a mixture of both a survey and interviews, and we covered all 408 local authorities. We invited them to take part in the survey across the UK, and 194 responded. So we got nearly a 50% response rate, which I think gives a good validity and authenticity to the data that's in the report. The survey was there really to find out to what extent there had been an increase in activity. So what was the quantity of activity between faith groups and faith-based organisations and local authorities over the pandemic. We then supplemented that with a series of interviews, 55 interviews with both local authority leaders and faith-based providers. And that was really to find out whether this increase in activity had also led to a difference in the relationship. So had it led in some way to a recalibrating or a reframing of the relationship between local authorities and faith groups. And so the report finds that, yeah, the answer to both questions is yes. There was a significant increase in the amount of activity over the course of the pandemic. 67%, so 2/3 of local authorities reported there had been an increase in activity with faith groups over that period. And they relied heavily on faith groups as first responders, if you like, to the pandemic. So literally when the lockdown started in March 28th, conversations between faith groups and local authorities were happening within days, and responses were being put into motion. So local authorities relied heavily in their deployment for faith groups to provide things like buildings, food banks, network information sharing, befriending, collecting food, cooking and delivering food, and providing volunteers for local authority programs. 60% of the local authorities who participated said that they cooperated with a food bank run by a faith group. But as we said before, this kind of increase in activity led to a kind of renewed appreciation of what faith groups do. It suddenly became clear that faith groups weren't just there for pandemics, but they were doing this work all the time of caring, restoring, healing, promoting justice. And this response by faith groups to the pandemic kind of opened the eyes of local authorities to what was going on in a very positive way. So a lot of the report talks about the admiration and respect that local authorities had for faith groups when they saw them in operation. They particularly appreciated their agility, their flexibility, and their professionalism in coming and working with other partners to meet immediate needs. And 91%, this is a stunning statistic, I think 91% of local authorities described their experience of partnership with faith groups as either very positive or positive. And the final element of the report looks a bit like we're discussing just now about the future. So every single local authority in this report is committed to working and developing relationships and partnerships with faith groups in their community as a result of this new appreciation and admiration for their work.
Some really encouraging findings there, Chris. Thanks for outlining them. That suggestion that the vast majority of local authorities describing the partnership between them and faith groups as very positive or positive, 91%. Incredible number. I want to bring David in at this point. David, you've been speaking to faith groups around the country. There's a positive response from local authorities. What are the faith groups on the ground feeling then in regards to the past 8 months or so in regards to what they've been doing and the relationship they've had with their local authorities?
Yeah, well, thanks, Marcus. The main part for faith groups was that it's the first time ever for a lot of them that they started to really engage with their local authorities. There's always a kind of a stakeholder group that sits there within a local authority, but actually on the ground, faith groups and faith organizations started working with public health, the police, local council. So there's much more of an engagement and a two-way discussion. Like Chris was saying, there was a lot of faith groups were saying that they were stepping forward in what they were doing. So they were running food banks, they were running, support groups, but they were also filling the gaps that people fall through sometimes in their communities. And that's volunteering, and that's helping the third sector, but also the statutory organisations. So there was a lot of great stuff being done at grassroots, which actually used to probably happen, but we never really saw it. And it was kind of a mass movement at that level. I think the other area that people talked about a lot was this embracing of digital. And it wasn't just about doing digital Zoom and making the place of worship still accessible and answering those spiritual needs of people. But there was this wonderful part about the discussion around isolation and loneliness, how they could use Zoom and new digital technology to just engage people, especially carers and those who were almost isolated because of COVID. And that's a fantastic thing that faith just embraced. And before that, really, a lot of people talked about place of worship where people came, you came to them. And what COVID did was allow them to go out and help people en masse. The other areas that we spoke about and which they found was that the investment in funding, that actually place of worship were being used to do real good. And they were talking about how to fund, and in the future, how to fund place of worship and faith groups in a social action sense. And that was really exciting, that people really wanted to step forward and do more. The relationship with faith and local authorities, well, that did, I will say, and Chris has got a great number, but for us in our regional ones, we found some were really good, some had existed for a long time. What we did find is where there'd been a faith covenant, and I think Stephen Timms was talking about in the earlier session, where there was a faith covenant and an existing relationship, that they were the strongest. And I think with Chris's data and information and the way we talk now, actually going forward, that would be something we would push even to Colin Bloom, is about, can we make those faith covenants stronger? And finally, I think what was great is that, and Chris was saying it, there was an understanding of faith, but individual faith, rather than this kind of, we are just one mass of faithful people. Actually, you know, I was lucky. I was able to work with the Baha'is, the Jains, Zoroastrians, but also the Hindus and the Jewish communities, such big communities, but also smaller minority communities who all want to play a part. And that's exciting stuff, Marcus.
We don't have a huge amount of time, so I'm going to ask this question to both of you, but if you can keep the answers succinct, it would be great. There's not an awful lot of good that's going to come out of this pandemic, but listening to you, there would be a suggestion maybe that the relationship between local authority and faith groups has benefited from this, and there are some perhaps lessons going forward that will keep that relationship strong in years to come as a result of what's gone on in the past months. David, your response first on that?
I think you're right. I think the relationship has got to build, and I think what I found, what we found when we did the regional ones, were that people of faith want to engage in their community and social action. And I think going forward of that, we just got to build on that want and that real drive. And I think they want to do that because of their faith, and not knocking anyone of no faith, but I think there was a real groundswell to do more.
Chris, same question to you.
Yes, so this desire to build forward into the future, if you look into the report, there are several areas which are identified where local authorities want to develop closer relationships with their faith groups, and 76% of local authorities said they wanted the relationship to continue after the pandemic. And the sort of things that we were talking about in the survey, 97% of local authorities would want to work together to raise awareness around food justice and poverty. They saw that as either very important or important with faith groups. 93 said they were interested in sharing best practice in a form of co-production. 83 said they would value increased resources, so very much what David was saying, to develop partnership working in the future. And interestingly, 83% identified as important or very important building of safe spaces for honest discussion regarding religion and belief. And I think if there's one real lesson that's come out of this report, it's that both local authorities and faith groups are interested in developing a different type of model of partnership and governance. So moving away from what one interviewee in our research said, well, at the moment we feel like junior partners in a relationship. But the kind of vision that's being very much offered here is one, moving towards much more model of co-production around goods and services, but also shared values as being integral to that innovation and best practice. And I think if there was one way which we could describe it, it's a shift growing between certainly local authority side. It's important to create a new policy space where we move from what works, which is still important, but equally to what matters. And I think it's the what matters discussion that will be the basis of a new relationship between local authorities and faith groups going forward.
Chris, what's your advice for those who are joining us today in regards to how they move this forward? Obviously, the session is about faith in a crisis, but we're all looking ahead, and this crisis has got a little way to go. We're not quite there yet, but after that, still, there's going to be plenty of opportunities for faith groups to be stepping up. What would be your advice to people on this call in regards to where they go next with local authorities and continuing to build that partnership?
I think it's a question of being confident, but in a non-hubristic way, and to recognise that when you read the report, particularly in the interviews, everyone is saying that what the pandemic did was focus attention on values and the importance of connecting values to policy. So if you want a critique of the way the policy tends to have developed in the last 40 years, you could say it's become detached from a kind of deeper sense of who we are as a society, who we want to be as people. And I think what faith groups have as a very strong trump card is that they're kind of, if you like, already used to talking in those terms about what really matters, what's important about society in which we live, what's important about us as people, and then linking that to the actions that they do. And I think that what local authorities were saying to us is that faith groups, in a way, helped them to reconnect values, beliefs, and worldviews, if you like, to policy. And I think that's the basis for discussion going forward. You'll get much more effective, long-lasting, and sustainable practice if you can also acknowledge what unites you in terms of values and common beliefs.
David, similar to that, for those of us who are kind of working on the ground in a faith context, it'll be nothing new to hear of the good that's been done by faith groups, not just in this pandemic, way before that, in regards to reaching out to the vulnerable in various different ways. I guess many will be wanting to see this as a building block to move things on. Again, your advice in regards to faith groups kind of being kind of loud and proud about what they do and making sure people are aware at just how big of an impact they're having in their communities.
Yeah, I think for me, it's about how we capture that evidence and we capture those stories and that lived experience, and we move that through to the government. And that's partly Faith Action or strengthening faith institutions or near neighbours, partners like that. There are opportunities in Chris's work as well. But I think there is a little bit about just being really open and honest about what you're doing in your communities. And people need support. Place of worship aren't always up for self-promotion. It's just not what they do. But there is this bit about how do we shine the light on where the light is? And I think that's part of what we have to think through in the future. Again, use obviously Premier Radio as much as possible, and just keep just doing good. Because actually, at the end of the day, there's a whole world of humility within faith, and we just got to learn actually as a voice to step forward. There has been reports, and I think in this session we're going to talk about it, where we've put a kind of pound value on our work, and that's in the billions. That's absolutely in the billions. And if we can get some more research on that, I think that will become more of an economic argument and a cultural argument. But there is this bit about how we learn to kind of sing our own praises and blow our own trumpets. I'm not a shy one for that, but I think there is a discussion with Faith Action and partners how we do that. So that's what I would ask people to look at. How do you talk and sell your story?
Chris, just finally coming to you, back on the Keeping the Faith report. We talked a little bit about kind of what you learnt through it, but you have put together some recommendations in terms of moving forward, some significant things that you're looking for from government in regards to this whole area. Do you want to just finish by talking kind of your hopes from this report?
Yes, thank you. So the three themes that emerged from the report in terms of a kind of new normal between faith groups and local authorities was a commitment to share innovation and good practice, a commitment to explore values and what kind of links people together, and as I said, a kind of a commitment to a different form of governance and co-production and partnership going forward. So the recommendations that came out of our report try and bring those three things together in the form of some policy tools. So the main kind of headline, so we call this resourcing the new normal, would be to appoint a faith commissioner whose job would be to promote and champion faith groups in society, and specifically, their role would be to strengthen relationships between local authorities and faith groups, and provide or facilitate opportunities for learning and development and support better informed strategic planning. I think that's the headline point, and that person would have the office of the Faith Commissioner who would undergo that role. There's various other recommendations, particularly I think around developing a toolkit out of the experiences from this report and others that would help faith groups and local authorities to plan and discuss better on a more equal relationship and partnership, the sort of long-term strategic planning that they would need to do for their own areas as we move forward out of the COVID crisis.
Great. That report you can find in the chat of this webinar, so do check it out. It's a great report, some fascinating findings, and really excited to see whether those recommendations do come to fruition. My thanks to Professor Chris Baker and Dr. David Solis. I appreciate your time today. Back over to you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, and special thanks to Marcus as well for taking us through that session. We've heard essentially from regional and local responses. We want to go on now. In a moment, we're going to hear from a parliamentary viewpoint. We should be joined by Steve Double MP, who's also a PPS in the Department of Health. He'll be joining us at any moment. But before that, I want to introduce you to our next panel of representation from the faith sector itself, faith leaders. We've got Dr. Jim McManus, who is Director of Public Health at Hertfordshire and a member of the government's task force on places of worship. Jim also performs any number of roles related to the Catholic Church and works quite closely with the Catholic bishops, particularly on issues of health. We'll hear from him in a moment. We've got Laura Marks, OBE, who's an interfaith social activist, policy advisor, writer, and media commentator. Most of us will have come across Laura as starting and founding the Mitzvah Day and Nisa Nasham. And we have Mandeep Singh, who's the director of Gurdwara Aid, which is an independent Sikh organisation set up to support Gurdwaras and Sikh charities. So we're looking forward to hearing from them. And finally, last but not least, Elizabeth Fuchs, who is the Near Neighbours Coordinator for West London. She's going to talk about near neighbours just generally for us, and appreciate her dropping in for this. Elizabeth previously worked around asylum seekers and refugees in Bradford. So really appreciate the panel joining us. As I said, Steve Double will drop in at some point. So I want to kick off first of all by giving a little bit of an opportunity for our panelists to say something on what their perspective has been of the faith response within the current crisis. I'm going to pick on Mandeep first, because actually in our role in recent time, Mandeep is normally picking on me. So I'm going to definitely pick on him first off. Mandeep, tell us a little bit about your perspective of a faith-based response within this COVID crisis.
Thank you, Daniel. I won't pick on you today, you're right. And I'd like to thank Faith Action for being there to allow many faiths to come together and discuss and provide a forum for that during this COVID times. I can talk around the Sikh faith and what Gurdwaras have been doing, and I think this is probably, a lot of this is probably true of many other faith groups as well, and there'll be some unique features that come out from the Sikh faith that I will also then talk about. I've seen the response that we've seen, because we work with Gurdwaras up and down the country in the UK. The responses that we've seen have been really through 8 main activities. Firstly, we've set up a regular Zoom call webinar with Gurdwaras up and down the country so they can discuss and have a forum to talk about the guidelines, the restrictions that are coming through, what they can and can't do, and important questions on particular aspects of the faith within the Gurdwara. So this has been going on since May, and we continue to do this. And it's also an opportunity for us to disseminate information to Gurdwaras around the guidelines of the changes in law and other things that might be relevant and they need to think about. And also best practice that we find as we're going through. The other things that we're finding are there's been an increase in online streaming of worship, which I think you will find across the board anyway. We've also found an increase in online workshops and seminars, especially mental health, abuse, but also prayer and history and religious history and theology type of workshops, which some of have been led by Gurdwaras themselves, but a lot of these have been led by individual congregations and individual charities and groups within the faith groups. The other side we've seen an increase in is chaplaincy type activities. So especially in the early days of the lockdown, where members of faith were in hospital, they couldn't be visited. There was a big issue there and a lot of concern there. Later on, as things were a little bit more relaxed, these activities seem to be increasing. So there's a lot more visits going on to people in hospital, in prisons, but also through video calls and so on. We've also seen an increase in activities in support groups, workshops, and activities following government guidelines in sort of people meetings. So they've been very small groups. So this could be a domestic workshop, a domestic abuse workshop, perhaps, or it could have been using things like art or other kinds of therapy to engage a small group of people to do that. And there's been numbers of examples of other activities that have been going through. A lot of these have been carried out within the Gurdwara premises or place of worship premises. We've also seen a large increase in volunteering, and especially in the unique aspect of the Sikh faith, which is Langar. So there's a large increase in that. We did a snapshot survey at the start of the lockdown, and around just under half of Gurdwaras were open, running Langar. Langar is something quite unique to the Sikh faith, and every Gurdwara will have a kitchen which produces free communal food for the congregation. Many Gurdwaras who were in COVID, they repurposed their kitchens to start producing food, hot meals for the local community. And a lot of these were going out to NHS, frontline staff, food banks, and also to individual households who had requested these. At the height, when we did a snapshot survey, across the UK, there was something like 90,000 hot meals being prepared a day with all Gurdwaras across the UK. So that's quite a significant number. And there's also implications from that in going forward and how we can sort of kind of build that into a response in crisis going forward, because that's something that seems to have not been picked up by government and local authorities. Other activities we've seen is interfaith activities. So, doing a lot more interfaith activities, and they've been really useful. So through groups like Faith Action, Faith United, and other sort of faith groups. And that's really helped because that allows us to share best practices, learn from each other, and try to disseminate that information within our own communities to see if we can bring everyone to a similar kind of standard and level and understanding. Those things have been really useful. I know since the workshop, since the places of worship have opened, or when they were open pre the second lockdown, a lot of Gurdwaras were giving space for personal worship inside the Gurdwara, and I know this has been quite common across many faith groups as well. So this is not quite unique, but those are the kind of things that have been going on. And I think some of the concerns have been that a lot of Gurdwaras haven't had necessarily had the good connections with local authorities. And so they've been kind of working in a silo almost, and that's been an issue or a source of concern, and trying to get funding from to run these kind of projects, especially for Langar outreach. A lot of Gurdwaras have been asking for money and raised that within their own communities to run that. So that's been going on. We've also had donors who've donated funds to allow free PPE to go to places of worship. So we've distributed something like 40,000 items of free PPE to around 200 places of worship, which are mostly Gurdwaras, but also mosques, synagogues, and mandirs as well, and churches as well. So a lot of these, there's been quite a different response, a recognition that things are different within space now. How we worship is different, and given that this is probably going to go on for most of next year, an expectation that this kind of activities are going to be continuing. And I think at the outset, when it was announced in May that places of worship would be opening, the expectation levels between government and local faith groups were very, very different, which of course led to a number of internal kind of discussions, heated debates, if you want to call it that, within each community, not within just the Sikh community. And I know it's been happening in the Muslim community and in the Christian community and the Hindu community, so it's been happening across the board. And that kind of suggests that perhaps there wasn't really a good understanding of how faith groups operate and the individual sort of characteristics of each faith. For example, Langar in the case of the Sikh faith and other things like that, which could have been perhaps looked at individually, and just a sensible compromise could have come through from that. So I'm going to leave it there because I could go on quite a lot more, but I think those are the kind of main activities that we've seen, and I just wanted to share the sort of activities that, from that perspective.
Thank you, Mandy. That's really good to get that kind of comprehensive view of the different areas, particularly related to the Sikh community, but I appreciate you and including other communities as well. Let me jump over to Laura, if I can. Nice to see you, Laura. And Mitzvah Day is coming up, isn't it? Am I right?
Mitzvah Day was last weekend.
Last week, I knew it was around here somewhere.
But this year we have moved to a month of mitzvahs, so we're still in that month. And the month coincides with a month of lockdown. So you're still in time.
Been tricky.
Don't you worry. There's always time.
I must have been getting that notification. I thought something's happening. How's that been, Laura, in lockdown? How's that been? How's that affected Mitzvah Day?
Well, I was thinking maybe I should talk a little bit about the Jewish community first of all, and I'll come on to Mitzvah Day if that's okay.
Thank you. No problem.
But I think so many of the things that Mandeep has been telling us have been, it will be the same in that the faith groups have stepped into gear, stepped into action. And I mean, some of the things that the Sikh community does, particularly around the way you feed people, which I think we all are amazed and astonished by how well you do that. I'm not sure that any of us live up to your example on that. But in terms of many of the other things and the general principles behind it, I think we've all been in the same boat. And I think that one of the things that really strikes all of us, I'm sure, as people from the faith groups, is that we do this stuff anyway, right? It's what we do. And I think that the realization by government, as we were hearing about in the report, and by local government, them suddenly thinking, oh my goodness, that's so interesting. We know this. And it's sort of one of the frustrations, I think, of faith groups that government and local government doesn't. Not that we do it in order to impress government, but it's just what we do. So many of the things are, of course, are the same. I think one of the things about the Jewish community that makes it slightly different is we are a very tight-knit, small community. I think we're about the same size as the Sikh community. We're very, very tight in that we're homogenous, not entirely, but we are largely homogenous. We are immigrants who came all around about the same time. We live almost entirely in North London and Manchester. A few other people dotted around the country, but very, very closely knit geographically, socioeconomically, educationally. We're a tight-knit group. And as a result of that, we have very well-developed institutions, which of course all fight amongst themselves because that's also the nature of us. But nonetheless, we have well-established institutions which have been able to kick in even more during the pandemic. So they were already there. So I think that there's a distinction in my mind to some extent between the things that we do to support ourselves as a community and the things we do to support others as a community. And maybe the pandemic has highlighted that for me even more, because a lot of the things within the community itself supporting ourselves have really had to step up. So for example, we have a charity, at least one charity particularly dedicated to mental health issues. And they have had to really step up their work, not only over the last few years anyway, but particularly during the pandemic, thinking about issues around wellness, around loneliness, around isolation and anxiety, and, at a minimal level, anxiety to a majorly level, dealing with suicidal thoughts and all sorts of awful things that are happening at the moment in the pandemic. We also have charities specifically relating to food poverty within the Jewish community. So there's a charity called GIFT, for example, and they work specifically to help ensure that people who are hungry within the community get fed. And we have dealt with all sorts of issues around how you bring the community together when you can't be in the same space. And some of those have been really quite Jewish issues. So, for example, after somebody's died, there's a ritual of coming together to pray together every day. And that's been impossible. And during the pandemic, of course, that has been really highlighted, because with an increased amount of deaths, the Jewish community, like the other minority communities, has been particularly badly hit. But probably our community has been badly hit because we are an aging community. So there's a disproportionate amount of old people in our community. And of course, old people and people in London were disproportionately hit. So we've dealt with a lot of death, or been dealing with a lot of death. So it's a very specific example of where the not being able to come together has particularly affected the Jewish community. But there'll be examples of that which affect different communities in all cases. So we're not different. It's just that each of our needs is slightly different, and the ways that we're having to deal with it is slightly different. And if you're an Orthodox Jew, you probably don't use the internet at all, and you certainly don't use it for prayer. So that's been an issue in the Orthodox communities. We have quite a well-developed relationship with government and local government at a national level and regional levels. There's a London Jewish Forum, for example. But nonetheless, there's enormous scope for those relationships to be better, so that government understands the needs of the Jewish community better in the pandemic. But I want to use the last just 2 minutes to talk about our work facing outwards, because I think that, like the other faith communities, we have been recognizing, not just now, but particularly now, the need to support the local communities. And Mitzvah Day, as Daniel mentioned, was last weekend, and that is, it's a very big day of social action that I set up. We're now in 30 countries, but based here in the UK. And pretty much every mainstream Jewish community will be taking part, facing outwards to think about the needs of the local community, and particularly thinking about how to do that with the other faith groups or people from other backgrounds, but particularly the other faith groups in that local community, whether, for example, it's joining with a mosque to support a local church food bank, or it's doing a cleanup in the local park, all sorts of projects that are local that people come together around. And this year, of course, suddenly we were faced with lockdown, not suddenly, but we were faced with lockdown. And we decided to focus absolutely on two key problems of today: loneliness and food poverty. Because those are not only the two that are screaming out at us to be dealt with, but they're also the two that you can do something about as an individual, as a family unit, even if you can't get together as a community unit. You know, you can deliver food to a food bank, you can phone your granny who's on her own. So really simple things that people could do this Mitzvah Day, and throughout the month, where we have really been focusing on what can we as individuals do to deal with these crises which are facing our society, and which it's hard to see how we're going to resolve, and life is going to change forever as a result of some of the issues we're facing now. I just want to finish with three thoughts, actually, quick ones. First of all, the thought that we should be doing this together. You know, Mitzvah Day is committed to doing it together, but we are all still bound in our own communities. That's what we do. And the nature of the pandemic and the nature of suspicion and fear and anxiety around the pandemic will lead to people being more inclined to close ranks and less inclined to open up. So the need to do things together, I think, is a big theme. Another one is the balance between the role, which you haven't really talked about, but there is this, I think that Chris was talking about the need for a new model where we have a more of a partnership between local communities, local authorities, and faith communities. But how that model is going to work so that we don't just substitute government for faith communities and suddenly expect the faith communities to pick up where local government should be doing the work, I think is going to be a really big challenge moving out of the pandemic, because the faith communities have stepped up, but that's not their job, all right? That they do it because they believe in it, not because we're paid to do it. So I think there's a really big issue there. And I think there's another issue, which is the role of women. And I don't know how your day has panned out, Daniel, in terms of numbers of women, but the women are, to a large extent, carrying a lot of this load. And, you know, if you ask about something like loneliness or food poverty, I would bet my bottom dollar that there's nobody who knows more about this and what's going on in the pandemic at the moment than the women of the faith groups. And they are carrying this, not only the women of the faith groups, but they are carrying a lot of it. And I think that we need to look at the role of women in this and think about what they're doing and how to make sure their voices are heard too. So I could carry on, but I will stop, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Laura, and a really good provoking thought there about the different roles. I have had reports through that some of the telephone networks are really playing up today, and I think that's somewhat why Jim is coming and going. So I will jump to, well, I see him there. Jim, are you with us?
I am, and I dipped out for a little bit for about a minute and a half of while Mandy was speaking, but yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll come to you. We're still expecting Steve Double to join us, so we'll just see. But if he jumps in, I may interrupt to bring him in, because I know, as with most politicians, they're slipping in and out of debates, so we have to kind of grab them when we can. But Jim, just tell us a little bit about your reflection. You are on the government task force around places of worship. So obviously you've got a bit of a bird's eye view on what's happening around what faith response within the COVID period has been, and obviously you've got the dizzy role of being the Director of Public Health for Hertfordshire there, which must mean that you might have all the time in the world at the moment to do things like that. So to join us. So tell us a little bit about your reflections. And then we'll go to Elizabeth, and hopefully Steve will join us. Either that, or we'll drag him into our reception next, so everyone can get to ask him questions. But go ahead, and it's Professor Jim McManus. I don't know why I said doctor. I've known Jim for a long time, and I gave him a completely different title. Anyway, Professor Jim McManus.
He's just Jim. I'm actually doing my doctorate in theology, and I'm not quite sure why. But it seemed a good idea at the time, but I've got a long way to go, and then COVID happened. I guess the thing for me to say to start with is actually that recent science says very strongly that there is a very important role for faith communities in well-being of society, and that's both from public health science and epidemiology as well as social sciences. There's also some good economic work. DTZ did a report back in 2006 on the role of faith communities in the northwest of England on the economy and their economic contribution. So I think the science is very strong and very good, whether you choose epidemiological science or whether you choose social science. Similarly, I think what we've learned from COVID has been that social cohesion and a sense that we're in this together are crucial in getting out of that. And I think we need to look at the work of the Faith Task Force through that lens. And the letter which went to the Prime Minister on the 5th of November actually summarises quite a lot of the social science and the epidemiological science on the importance of faith communities. They are vital, they are important. And I believe the Minister has understood that. And I think what government is trying to do is find a way of working with faith communities. And I think the way we've worked has created a nexus of opportunity, because actually, if you look at what has happened is that the government and Public Health England and public health professionals have focused on the public health science. Faith communities have focused on the theological issues for their faith community of contextualizing guidance and science that's come out. A number of us have had a foot in both camps, so have been engaged in translating one to the other. And I think that actually gives us a good lens for how faith and government could work together. The idea that we come with a complementarity of knowledge, skill and experience and constituency, and work together to produce something that is better than what we both started with. And it models a way, I think, of coming across fields and disciplines. And I would like to see that continue. That would be my personal view. I think one of the other things to say is that actually faith communities through this have modeled good practice in keeping communities safe. So it hasn't been published, but it's been widely trailed that the guidance for faith communities that was developed during the first lockdown for reopening was so effective that there have been fewer than 50 incidents of infection attributed to faith communities since lockdown that Public Health England can find in its data. That's a fraction of 1%. Now, before anybody says that should be an excuse for not closing faith communities in the first place, actually, we're doing better than other countries in reducing faith-based outbreaks because our faith communities have stepped up to the plate. So I commend, for example, I'm not going to talk about the great social care work that's been done, but I commend, the Muslim Council of Britain, the United Synagogue, Faith Action. I could go on through all the faiths, Sikhs and Hindus, the Catholic Church, the Church of England, the Free Churches, for their guidance. Because what we know is that they've kept people safe. So we've delivered. So I think we've gone from, I think the Faith Task Force could be used as a bit of a model of how this nexus created by the science and COVID, in terms of the need that has arisen, could create ways where church and government and church and local government can work together. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but I've been working 12-hour days, 7 days a week since March with very little time off. And, we've delivered in our area over 150,000 food parcels, and we've used volunteers and faith communities with that. And we're now ramping up for winter. I guess for me, there are some reflections about us going forward as faith communities. And forgive me if I sound a bit explicitly Christian. There is a discussion about where well-being and healing fits into our mission and service. And those are perhaps very loaded Christian terms. The work of dealing with the huge burden of mental health that will be going forward, the huge burden of angst, modelling hope, modelling ways out of this, I think are a real opportunity for us. And I think the second thing for us to reflect on is how we act as a leaven in the world, not just through this lockdown, but through into recovery and beyond. This is going to be a marathon. And a final point is, we're not in a pandemic, we're in a syndemic, a range of different things: mental health, job loss, hunger, housing, uncertainty, fear, grief, loss, a whole range of things all coming together that will take us years to recover. The science is with us, which is what I started to say. There is an opportunity created by the science and the need. There is a model, I think, a very modest model in the way some of the faith task force has worked, because faith communities have punched their weight with government and punched above their weight with government. It hasn't been government doing unto it, has been us working together. And going forward into recovery and beyond, how can we be that leaven for the world with the syndemic effects going forward? That would be my 10 pence worth, Daniel, if that makes any sense.
Jim, as always, your 10 pence worth is worth a lot more. Jim has been doing a terrific amount of work, and I think has managed to publish more things in the past 6 months than I have managed to do in 45 years. So he's certainly someone to keep an eye on in terms of what he's doing and stuff. And we are very pleased to have him as one of the advisors to Faith Action as well. And he does really give that superb bridge between the public sector, health and faith. So thank you, Jim. Elizabeth, I'd want to bring you in. Steve has now joined us and he's just settling in. He has got the best background, which I believe is from his constituency. So I'm not going to focus too much on the sun down in Cornwall. But Elizabeth, tell us a little bit about your reflection on what Faith has done during this COVID time, and obviously we'd love to hear a little bit about the work of their neighbours as well.
Yeah, thank you. As I said, I work for Near Neighbours, an organisation that is about bringing people together in communities that are religiously and ethnically diverse so that they can get to know each other better, build relationships of trust and collaborate together on initiatives that improve the local community they live in. And we understand that faith institutions play a vital role in promoting healthy communities across the UK. And during this crisis, we have seen that faith communities have been able to draw on their unique assets. I know several of us here have already mentioned the vast pool of volunteers who have brought great energy and commitment to the response efforts. They've been able to utilise their buildings. I know I've seen churches, mosques and other faith spaces being transformed into food hubs, testing centres and a lot more. And our faith centres have been really well placed to identify vulnerable people through the regular weekly contacts that they have with people in the community. They have relationships of trust. Often people may feel more comfortable about going to a faith space rather than an outside organisation that they don't know. Our faith communities have helped to encourage people in their faith, as our Sikh friend has shared. Many move into online platforms and being innovative about the key celebrations. For example, I know a synagogue that celebrated the Jewish New Year from their cars in a local rugby ground. And these forums have helped to bring hope and combat fear for so many people. And I think it's safe to say that our faith leaders have really acted as a trusted and reliable source of information. Statements by religious leaders have been essential and has served as a reinforcement of government messaging. Many of our faith institutions are deeply rooted as they've been in the community for such a long time, and therefore were able to respond really efficiently and effectively, knowing who to reach out to. Our faith communities have been able to build on the work, as many have said here, that they have been doing for decades, including the work of food banks, winter night shelters, wellbeing support, refugee support, and much more. And a real strength of our faith communities is that they really aren't going anywhere. They were here long before COVID, and they've been here during the pandemic and will continue to be here beyond this crisis, reaching out and serving the communities they're part of. And throughout this crisis, Near Neighbours has really seen a mixed picture of how faith communities and local councils have worked together. I know in the borough of Ealing, the council had and still has a weekly briefing with faith leaders, where they update them on public health, support for vulnerable residents, and there's an opportunity to feedback and ask questions. The council was able to reach out to Near Neighbours as they knew we had established faith forum, faith relationships on the ground, and bring them into the conversation and consultation. I feel it's worked best in the areas where there is an established faith forum and good working relationships with the council. For example, in Barnet, Near Neighbours has worked closely with Barnet Multi-Faith Forum, who have a faith covenant, which I know has been mentioned in previous conversations, which was formalised with Barnet Council, and they're committed to work together in delivering the services needed for the community. In terms of improving and building on the work done so far, I personally would love to see local councils and central government continuing to acknowledge and support the invaluable contribution faith communities make. To see more support for faith communities and organisations, including faith forums, it would be fantastic to see a faith forum in every borough and county. Faith forums provide a real safe space to develop understanding, nurture relationships across faith, and build confidence and trust in working together for when times of crises happen, like it just has with COVID. I know the path ahead will be hard and steep for years to come, with many societal challenges, but the majority of our faith groups are committed to the flourishing of all in their community and have deep integrity in this. They have an accountability to God or a higher power that is much bigger than themselves. They will continue to play a pivotal role in utilising their assets and being a voice of hope for all and a source of help for vulnerable people. And in closing, I just wanted to share one example on the ground. I've worked with a great organisation called Burnt Oak Women's Group, made up of majority Muslim women who participated in a programme Near Neighbours run called Real People Honest Talk. And during that programme, they identified they needed a community hub to run a drop-in to help bring people together. And through Near Neighbours funding, they were able to do that. But when COVID hit, they transformed the space they were hiring into an emergency food hub, working with partners on the ground. They were able to, now they've got the new, I think it's the new North London Synagogue dropping off food donations on a weekly basis. They've managed to get the headmaster of the local school to use their minibus to pick up food supplies. And they're in touch with other organisations, donating things on a weekly basis. In fact, we had Mitzvah Day come and visit them a couple of days ago. A true community effort, and without people of faith, this project wouldn't be happening and hundreds of families wouldn't get the support they so need at this difficult time.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's a really excellent summary, and thank you for weaving all those bits together for us. Appreciate that. I just, in terms of, we've obviously juggled things a little bit, and we're really pleased to have Steve Double join us. Just one of the reflection that Jim's just posted me is that the work that Colin Bloom talked about in terms of this call for evidence, and the work that Chris Baker led on looking at the faith response, the work of local authorities connecting with faith, really gives a massive opportunity, a real opportunity for a bedrock for ongoing and developing work between faith, local communities and government. Steve Double is with us. We appreciate Steve coming. So often when these things happen, different things, people drop out completely, but Steve has shown his real commitment to us by coming. Steve's the MP for St Austell and Newquay. He's also the Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Department of Health and Social Care, and he's an officer of the APPG on Faith and Society. Steve, thank you so much for joining us. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Dan. And sorry to jump in at this stage and feel a bit bad I've missed the other contributions, but hopefully it's been an interesting time. I'm sure you appreciate it's been a fairly busy day in the Department of Health with all the announcements today. So
it has been, yeah. No, I
had to wait until the Secretary of State had finished his statement before I could leave, and then was being chased by the media to comment because. As you may have heard, Cornwall's one of the only places in the country, the only two places in the country that's in Tier 1 next week. So people were very interested to talk about that. But delighted to be here and to join you, and really just to share a few perspectives from very much a personal point of view about how I see my faith affecting and shaping my work and role as an MP. Just to very briefly explain for those who may not know my background, Dan and I first got to know each other 20-something years ago when we were both much younger and thinner. And I was pastoring a church in Cornwall, and I was involved in church leadership for about 15 years or more before I got involved in politics and got elected as an MP. And I think, particularly over the last few months, but I think this is something that I've carried with me throughout the 5.5 years I've been an MP. is very much that my faith, firstly and foremostly, is a very personal thing to me, and shapes the way that I live, and the way that I behave, and the way that just I am as a person. And particularly over the last 7 or 8 months in the midst of the crisis. I mean, one of the things about being an MP over the last 5.5 years is I thought the previous Parliament was historic and unprecedented, and once in a lifetime experiences that anyone would live through in Parliament. And then we hit March this year and realised that the last few years pale into insignificance compared to the challenges that we're currently facing. But if there's any time when your faith should come to the fore, it's at times of crisis, at times of uncertainty, at times of great concern and worry for people. And the fact that I have part of my life which provides me with a sense of peace, a sense of certainty, just a sense that while the rest of the world is facing huge crisis and uncertainty, that I know that someone else is in control of all this. And although sometimes you may wonder how and what way, that at a personal level I know that my life is not dependent on the circumstances that I'm living in, and that my faith and my relationship with God is at the start of that. And one of the best compliments that have been paid to me over the last few months is when colleagues in Parliament come up to me and say, "Steve, you're the PPS to the Secretary of State for Health, one of the busiest and most pressured and stressful roles in Parliament, and yet you're so relaxed and at ease with everything." And some of that's my natural disposition, as Dan will testify, but ultimately it just comes from a sense of I can only do what I can do, and actually my life is in God's hands, and therefore that does bring a sense of peace and security to me. And I think that more than anything at times like we're living through is something that those of us who have a faith and have that as an anchor in our lives can testify to, that in the midst of a storm we can still be at peace. So that's a first observation for me. And the other thing that I think is, I'm aware that for many people being an MP is a very privileged role, and in many ways it is, and I absolutely accept that. But I genuinely try to approach it in the same way I've done every job I've done in my life. And I believe that everyone of faith, and every Christian or anyone of any other faith, should approach their role in that, at the end of the day, we're all here to serve. We're all here to do what is right and do the best we can in whatever role that we have. And that's true whether you're a teacher, a businessman, a nurse, working for a local council, working in an office, a factory, whatever you're doing as a Christian. We seek to do it as an act of service and do the very best we can. And that's something that, I tried to bring to my role as well. But I think the one thing in the midst of all of this, as a politician, as an MP, that I think has to be the hallmark, and this is particularly true in the times that we live in, where, I'm sure we're all aware that, we live in pretty fractious times politically, and sadly, the level of division, the level of abuse, the level of at times, sadly, threats that are going on, and a time when people can become very polarized and very divided, is actually the way I treat other people is first and foremostly the most important thing. And whether that's my colleagues in Parliament, whether it's my staff who work with me, whether it's the constituents or other people, and particularly when there's a lot of abuse and hatred going on, actually how you respond in those situations, I think more than anything, is very much a key, and to try and be gracious and forgiving and bring reconciliation. And I don't pretend I always get that right. It's sometimes a real challenge, but I think that is very much at the heart of it. And then just coming to sort of the current situation, I think, you don't need to tell me that the huge challenges that we have faced as a country, and the government and Parliament has been working through a time where, there is no manual, there is no blueprint, there's very little we can look to even in history that would try and inform what should be done now. And just that sense of, you know, not really knowing the answers day by day, and you know, and I know there will always be people who think they could have done a better job, or know better, or look to criticize, and that's part of politics, and I accept that. But in my role, knowing that every day people are working to just try and do what they believe is right and best in the circumstances with the information we have at hand, and just trying to bring a sense of the values that, you know, I believe we should live for as Christians and people of faith generally, of honesty and integrity, of authenticity into the midst of that. And, you know, sometimes the most difficult thing as a politician is to admit you haven't got the answer. And that is really difficult. But the reality is sometimes you just have to say that, you know, we are doing our best in the hugely difficult challenges we face. But we don't pretend to have got it all right. We don't to be at the heart, you know, to have the monopoly on the answers, and that is a real challenge at times. And then I think just finally, the other thing that, you know, I think has been really important for me over the last few weeks, particularly, is to be a voice for the faith community in Parliament, and you know, when I can, to stand up and say things in the chamber, but probably more often than not actually behind the scenes. And you know, I was disappointed, I have to say, and I told the Prime Minister I was disappointed with churches and other places of worship having to close 3 weeks ago. I'm delighted that they will be able to open next week. But you know, to try and continually remind ministers of the value of the faith community in our country, just how much, and some of the comments I did manage to catch earlier, just the absolutely vital role that they play in our communities right across the country, and particularly with the challenges we're currently facing, just how important their role is and how much work they are doing, not all about holding worship services, etc., but just engage with the community and seeking to support and bless and serve the community in 100 different ways. And to just continually remind ministers of the importance of this, because, you know, sad reality is in today's increasingly secularized world, that often gets pushed out, and actually just to keep being able to bring that to the fore, and maybe, you know, even at times boldly suggesting that, you know, maybe churches or other faith communities might have a role to play that would help in certain situations where maybe that's not immediately been thought of. So yeah, I hope that's helpful and interesting, but you know, just a few personal perspectives of particularly in the light of the current circumstances, how I think being a Christian in the House of Commons is important, and how I seek to make the connection between the two.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to just hold on to you for a minute, because so one of my team has accused me of not paying enough attention because I keep looking off to the side. That's because I'm scanning some questions that have come in. It's not because I'm quickly catching up on Netflix. But I want to summarise some of the questions and challenges that have been coming, Steve. And it's a tough one. I wouldn't know how to answer this myself, so I'll throw it at you, and you can say you don't have the answer if you want. Part of the thing that's been presented is there not a problem, I suppose a status problem, about government being in one place and faith's just responding in the other, whereas potentially faith has got a role as a critique in some sense of government policy, and actually should faith just be seen as the social action kind of arm? How do you think we find a good balance between the role of government, the role of local government, and the role of faith? I don't know if you track that one, but
well, I mean, I think, you know, I would say that is one of the real questions, and I will say I don't think I have the answer to that in terms of how we make it work. I think, you know, in many ways it's what the APPG is about, isn't it? Is how we get the place of faith and faith communities into the overall sphere of government, whether that's national or local, because I do believe it has a role to play, and certainly as a country throughout our history, there have been many times when it's had a very significant role to play, and particularly in today's culture, how we seek to both maintain, because I think some of it is actually about holding the line and not allowing things to go backwards from our perspective, but hopefully also in some ways advance and enhance that, is to increasingly get the role of faith communities to be understood and accepted and embraced by Parliament. And I think that the honest answer is that some parts of government are much more open to it than others. And that largely depends on the views of the ministers in any given position. There are some people I know well who are incredibly open and positive. I think we could probably all, agree whether we agree with him on everything. But the leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, is an incredible advocate in Parliament for the role of faith and church and faith communities generally in our society. And there are others like him, but the reality is there are many who are very closed on that. So I think it is a huge challenge, and it largely is about finding the people in government you can work with in this particular sphere.
That's a great non-answer, Steve. You gave us an answer even though you said you weren't going to. I think that's really good. We're gonna, in a moment, we're gonna move on and give people opportunity to come on to another Zoom where they can break into groups and say and put their questions and those kind of things. And then this afternoon at 4, we're going to have this session on essentially faith in the future, looking hopefully on the pandemic and that kind of thing. I just want to give you the opportunity to say any thoughts that you had in terms of how you see the role of faith within society going on from here. And to some extent, this has been a seminal change. We can't go back. We won't forget the pandemic, in that sense. And life has changed. So what do you think the changes could be?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, because I would have certainly been interested to join you for that, but I am on the train heading back to Cornwall at 4 o'clock this afternoon. But I think, as you say, that there are so many aspects of life, I think, that will permanently be altered as a result of this pandemic. And I certainly think that the way we view church and faith communities in general within our country needs to be part of that equation. Many churches I know have found new and innovative ways of engaging with people, and there's an astonishing statistic that came out after the end of the first lockdown, which that were 1 in 4 people in the UK during the lockdown sought to engage with a faith community in some way online, which is an incredible statistic when you think about it. 1 in 4 people. And I think there is clearly an opportunity that in times of uncertainty and crisis, there will be people who are possibly more open to faith than they would otherwise be. And I think it's important that we are there for those people and open to engage with them. But I also think, there are some very big questions that we need to ask ourselves about just the very nature of church and what church is here for, how it engages with people in a new, technological age, in the age of Zoom, how do we make that work? But also I think to perhaps, just have a rethink about the very nature of what we're here for, and how we serve our communities and meet the needs of our communities in way, because I think my observation is as we come out of this, people, there will be some people who will just be desperate to get back to life as normal as quickly as possible, and that's the case. But I think there will also be a significant number of people who will stop and reevaluate their lives and think, what is life actually all about? What are my priorities? What should be the things that I focus on for the rest of my life? And I certainly, in that space, there is an opportunity for the church and for other faiths to engage with people and perhaps reshape the way we see faith communities functioning, to make sure that those people find a space to belong and to be part of it. Okay.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you for those final thoughts. And I just want to thank the rest of the panel as well for joining us. I'm very aware that there may well be some people that have jumped onto the other Zoom, so I won't go on for ages here, but just to thank those who have joined us for this session. So we kicked off with Colin Bloom and obviously Chris Baker and David Solis. Marcus Jones took us through in probably a much more succinct fashion than I have. Jim, I believe, is going now to fight out what tier Hertfordshire will be in. So I think he's had to pop off already. Mandy, great to have you here, and hope you join us again, Laura and Elizabeth. And I just want to give a big thanks to the Faith Action team who've worked so hard over the past little while and put this event together. And some are going on to other things, and some will be hanging on with us for the next things. Do be in touch if you are not going to join us for the next session. There's a session of 4 as well as we look to the future. But obviously there'll be much more funding onto the Faith Action website, which is www.faithaction.net, and we'll be looking to put up some kind of recording after this. But thank you very much. If you're wanting to go and be part of those discussion groups, we've made good note of some of the things you've been saying and passing those through, and try to feed some questions through. If you want to have an opportunity to talk, do join us at that reception now. But we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you very much.